All right, well, welcome back to Daytimers. Sandy, would you introduce your family to all of us now?
My sister-in-law, Donna, and she's visiting from Seattle for a few days.
Wonderful. Yeah, welcome to Donna. Seattle area, which is what feels like home to me, even though I've now lived most of my life in Oregon, but good. Yeah, there's a lot of sad Seahawks fans up there these days. Yeah, yes, they do. It's been a while since we've said that. Oh, yeah. The Seahawks. Speaking of Seattle, yeah, they're doing better than the Huskies, but in some ways. We'll see what happens in the future for that. It does fit the theme of today, which is the Exodus. Whether that's fans leaving or people wanting coaches or quarterbacks to get an Exodus out of the current situation and try something new to a new land of milk and honey. It does fit. So we're working our way through Chad Bird's The Christ Key, unlocking the centrality of Christ in the Old Testament. And today is to look at how the Exodus story really becomes kind of the overarching story of the Old Testament. And then that becomes even the primary way that we understand Jesus and what he's done for us and for the world in his own sacrifice. So it's a real big theme, a real big topic. And actually, we're not going to spend hardly any time in the book of Exodus or talking about Moses, but we're going to actually see how that Exodus story was already anticipated in the lives of the patriarchs in Genesis. And then also those events were then captured by the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea in talking about the Messiah to come and what will happen with yet another Exodus. So it'll be more how instead of studying the Exodus, we'll be studying how the Exodus forms kind of the best way that the prophets described the hope to come. And then, of course, as Christians, seeing now how Jesus not only fulfilled prophecies connected to being a new and greater Moses or leading us out of Exodus, but how this now breaks open the story of Israel into a story for all nations and all peoples. So that what we have in Jesus is this great cosmic Exodus, not just of one nation from one nation's control, but of all peoples from the power of sin, death, and the devil, and brings all of us into this liberation, this freedom in Christ. So before we get any further, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask for his wisdom. Gracious God, we thank you for the ongoing witness of the Old Testament to show us that you came and fulfilled the hopes and the fears of all the years which were met in Christ. And we ask for your wisdom as we study your word so that we can see how not only have you brought out your people from slavery, but you would also bring out each of us from idolatry, from spiritual homelessness. And you do that to us individually, and you do that for us as a people together. So we pray for this wisdom that we might be encouraged in a time of not so much exile, but a time of disruption. So give us this encouragement through your Spirit, we pray. Amen. Well, let's start with a pop quiz. I gave you Moses and the big Exodus, but as you think about some of the stories and figures of the Old Testament, how many people or times in Israel's history was there either an exile and a return, or like an uprooting, or a coming and a going someplace else? How many sort of miniature exiles and returns can we think of?
Babylon.
Yeah. Yep. So we've got the Babylon. We've recently studied here. Well, I guess Ezekiel might have been a year ago. I don't even remember now. We did Ezekiel as a study of a prophet for our times, because the people were in exile to Babylon. This is like 6 centuries before the birth of Christ. Yeah, and we talked about how, we're not exiled from our homes, but we're kind of exiled to our homes from our public life. And that's changed a bit, but it's also far from the end. Good. Yeah. So Babylon, that's come up more than once. What else? What other exiles and returns, either as a group, a nation, or even as individual people?
Joshua leading people in the kingdom.
Yeah. 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 The Exodus really wasn't completed with Moses. He stayed outside of the promised land. Yeah. So Joshua brought them in, and we'll see a little bit later even how that arrival was very similar to what Moses did previously. Yeah.
Well, Jesus and Mary and Joseph were really exiled to Egypt.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Since this is a book and a class on the Old Testament, we really don't get to the Gospel of Matthew at all. But the Gospel of Matthew is absolutely like taking the template of Moses's life and saying Jesus is the new and greater Moses. Matthew is the one that gives us the flight to Egypt as a young child, along with many other things. King Herod comes across looking very like Pharaoh in Matthew's gospel, and Jesus checks all the boxes on Moses's thing, from the Sermon on the Mount, taking the place of the receiving the 10 Commandments and giving it to the people of Israel from the Mount Sinai. So many other examples as well. In fact, Jesus has 5 long sermons in Matthew. And so there's kind of the 5 books of Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, kind of in miniature. Yeah, so that's a great one. Jesus and his own family after his birth. Good. Others? I'll give you another one right off the bat. Adam and Eve are exiled east of Eden, out into the wilderness.
Abraham and Sarah, who, from wherever they were to.
Abraham and Sarah from the Ur of the Chaldeans, somewhere over in Mesopotamia, Babylon. From there to the land I will show you, and then they get there and they don't really spend a lot of time there. Something actually happens. In fact, we don't have to turn to it, but that's kind of the first place Chad Bird takes us is to say Abraham and Sarah, they set foot in the promised land, and all of a sudden there's a famine, and they had to keep going until there's food. They end up in Egypt. And you remember Abraham's great plan while they're in Egypt, how to protect themselves. So he and Sarah at this point they're Abram and Sarai. So they have their old names, and they're young, and Sarai is still pleasing to the eye and the sight of Pharaoh. And Abram has this, a wonderfully terrible plan to pass off his wife as his sister, and that therefore sort of gain the favor of Pharaoh because she would be welcomed into his harem. We don't really have any more detail of what exactly happened to her in the harem, but using her as an in to Pharaoh. And eventually, not only do Abram and Sarai leave, but they leave now rich. That actually, this actually got them rich quickly. His fake sister caused Pharaoh to deal well with him, and he ends up with sheep, oxen, donkeys, servants, more donkeys, and camels. And so then they can head off back towards the promised land. Of course, by the end of Abraham's story, even after he's received the promise of a son, even after he and Sarah tried to take the promise into their own hands and work out a situation with Hagar, the handmaiden, and they have Ishmael, the first biological son, but not the son of the promise. By the end of Abraham's story, he really has no land in the promised land, except he bought a little bit of land so that he could bury his wife there. And that was all he actually owned at the end of his life. There's another exile and return actually in Abram's pretty immediate family. So Isaac, he just has to go find a wife. So that's a pretty brief story. Isaac doesn't have a whole lot of chapters, but Jacob, what happens to Jacob? He takes his brother's birthright but then he has to end up leaving home anyway. Doesn't get to enjoy that birthright. He's got to take off because Esau is going to kill him. And so Jacob is exiled, just a brotherly rivalry here. And then Jacob ends up in a faraway land, but he falls in love. But it turns out, it's okay. Turns out his father-in-law, Laban, tricked him, and he ends up marrying the other sister, not the one he actually loved. And now he has to work another 7 years for his father-in-law in order to marry Rachel, the one he actually loves. And so Laban becomes kind of this miniature Pharaoh who's basically found a way to enslave Jacob and use him to work his land, and uses his own daughters to hook him and keep him around. But eventually Jacob leaves Laban. He brings his wives, and he becomes very rich as well. That Jacob pulled his own tricks, and he ended up with, certain of the livestock. Okay.
Did that impede Laban's income dramatically?
I don't know. I would imagine so. Of course, he didn't chase him quite like Pharaoh chased.
No, but I just wondered if that left him.
I don't think he impoverished him. I think he had a way of marking certain ones slyly so that he got to, oh, that one's, got a mark. I'll take that one too. Yeah. So Jacob's a good example as well of an exile and a return. There are some others. You mentioned Joshua. And in fact, when Joshua leads the people finally into the promised land, their entrance is also this dramatic river crossing. And they end up, the waters stand in a heap, and they end up crossing the Jordan River on dry ground. So just Moses' successor has a very similar story. And in fact, they crossed the river on the same day that on the same day of the month of the same anniversary date of the Passover night when the lambs were sacrificed and Israel left Egypt in the first place 40 years previously. So Joshua's a very obvious one. We already talked about Gideon a little bit. Gideon had sort of his own Moses-like story. Naomi, how about Naomi? She and her family went into exile because of famine. But she didn't come back rich. She came back empty, but was made rich by Ruth meeting Boaz. King David, he had a number of exiles. Initially he was exiled because he was on the run from King Saul, and really couldn't come home until the death of Saul. But David also had other exiles where his own son was after him, and he had to get lost. So there's plenty of those. Now let's actually turn in our Bibles to Isaiah 11. And we'll be at the beginning of the chapter, Isaiah 11. And while you're doing that, I'll just restate that, for us as in our own day and age, in our own context, we really have not, I don't think anybody in this room has been a political refugee. I don't think any of us has had to cross a border and plead for asylum. I don't know that any of us have been homeless for a time. We do have a hard time with a pretty secure, privileged existence with putting ourselves in the shoes of all of these exiles, and how tangible, how physical, how concrete the actual hopes for exile or for return from exile would be. But over the course of this pandemic, we've done a number of studies that are trying to sort of not so much spiritualize it, but to say, that there is still exile. It's just not the same kind as some of these folks. But of course, we also recognize that in the world today, there's all kinds of refugee crises. And it's not only a political hot topic, but it is a call to the church to find our role in helping people. And I think the pallet shelters and our five young folks who live out there right now are an example of us trying to provide a return to some exiles. And in most cases, sin is such an original and genetically transmitted disease that we're all paying for the sins of our fathers, and our children pay for our sins. And so it goes that we can provide a home for some young men. At this point, I think it's all men, and they can have a secure place to sort of work through some of those things. All right, Isaiah 11. We've been here fairly recently. I don't remember which week it was, but this is a great Advent Christmas text. This shoot that shall come from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. So in our family, we just started our Advent devotional because most of them don't start till December 1st, even though Advent starts the Sunday before, 4 Sundays before Christmas. Anyway, our Advent devotional is the Jesse tree. And so this is a very common image of Advent, this idea that whenever Israel finds herself to be a stump, God is producing a shoot, a green shoot from the stump. And it's actually where we got our baby Abel's middle name. His middle name is Jesse, because he was, for us, he was the first child born after a miscarriage for us. And so he was the shoot that came from the stump. And we wanted to mark that in his name. God can always bring hope out of sadness. So here the prophet is talking about this shoot. He's his immediate reference would be to David. David is literally the shoot of his father Jesse. So King David is that immediate, obvious shoot. But by this point in time, Jesse's tree is a stump. So he's really talking about Israel after David and after all the evil kings that succeeded him. And after these exiles, particularly the exile to Babylon that Sandy has mentioned, Israel is stumped. Most of the tribes of Israel were already exiled 2 centuries previously by the Assyrian Empire. And they were scattered all over the ancient world, especially toward the north. But now here for Isaiah the prophet and for the remaining tribes of Judah and the southern tribes like the Levites and the southern kingdom, they are now themselves in exile. They're stumped too. We're going to skip down to verse 10. On that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. On that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that is left of his people. From Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Ethiopia, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, the hostility of Judah cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, Judah shall not be hostile toward Ephraim, but they shall swoop down on the backs of the Philistines in the west. Together they shall plunder the people of the east. On and on it goes from there. So what's the prophet saying? When that branch from Jesse's stump appears, he is not only going to produce a second Exodus, but that Exodus is going to bring not just the people from one place like Babylon, but all the peoples of God scattered throughout the world, from the 4 corners. Bring them back together. In verse 15, he talks about the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt and will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind and split it into 7 channels and make a way to cross on foot. So there shall be a highway from Assyria for the remnant left of his people, as there was for Israel coming up from the land of Egypt. So again, instead of parting the Red Sea, now you're taking the river Euphrates and you're splitting it into 7, which means it's not much of a river at that point. So you can just ford 7 rivers without too much trouble. But again, this massive picture of a worldwide exodus of God's people out of those lands and back home. And one of the words for this recovery, the Lord recovering them, it's the word for redeem or redemption, which of course becomes some way we talk about Jesus redeeming us. Okay. So at this point now we have Israel scattered now. They're not all in Egypt, but Israel's scattered all over the place. Now they're going to come back together. They're going to be brought home through this new Exodus. But we're also starting to get these nods or these hints that it's not just going to be the Israelites who come home, but it's going to be the nations. That this branch of Jesse, it said, the nations will inquire of him. So you start to see things like we three kings of Orient are, and you see these foreign leaders coming and inquiring of the child who was born under the star. You get King Herod hearing about this child and inquiring of him. You get when Jesus is an adult, you get other Herods inquiring about him. You get Pilate, Caiaphas the high priest. You get all these sort of leaders asking about this Jesus. And then eventually, as the church is formed, and as the apostles go out in mission, the shape of the book of Acts is that Paul ends up in Rome, and he's going to have the audience of Caesar himself, so that the nations will inquire of this branch of Jesse, this Jesus Christ, this Messiah that all these Christians are so excited about. And so much more than just Israelites coming home in a new Exodus, we begin to see the hope that what God's going to do through this branch of Jesse is going to actually be an exodus for all people, that all people can come away from idolatry, come away from death, and come to the one true God. Anything here before we turn a little further into Isaiah? Okay. We're going to go to Isaiah 51 now. It is quite a prominent feature of our faith that it is so cross-cultural, so diverse, so global. I think by 2030, it might be a little later now, but I mean, in the next 10 to 20 years, there should be more Christians in China than in the United States. And then you look at where, the church is booming globally. Not so much in the United States or in Europe, but it's booming. The church is growing. The nations coming to the Lord. And the Christian faith we have such a very translatable faith that it will translate the gospel into any language. and in sometimes we have to invent a written language so that we can then translate it into that written language. Bethesda's had our missionaries that we've sent who've done that kind of work. And that's a really incredible feature that I don't want us to overlook. And so we'll continue to kind of note that as we go.
Do we know about the younger people and the growth of the younger people coming to church?
Here in the United States? Oh, it's falling off a cliff.
Falling off a cliff?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the most dramatic drop that's really been noted ever.
What about the other nations?
It's different. I mean, the faith is growing among young people as well globally. Yeah, but in terms of youth in the sort of Western world, it's not a pretty picture. But again, you have to separate. I mean, it's really hard to study those things. So sometimes you have to separate out, like, what are you looking for to qualify as faith. Because there's a lot of people who are leaving church, but not Jesus. Assuming you can leave church and still keep Jesus, because sometimes you end up with other problems. Others are leaving organized denominations for house churches and small associations. And some will still identify as Christians, but they just maybe on Christmas or Easter, they'll come to worship, or, maybe when there's a funeral, they'll get very conservative in their beliefs again about life after death. But so it's hard to really actually, get a handle on it. But in terms of the public animosity towards the faith, it's quite dramatic among younger people. And it's not been helped by the last 20 years of life in America. Basically from 9/11 forward, it's just one hit after another. And Christianity has been so closely identified in our country with how you have to vote and how you have to agree. Every topic, every political topic's been handed to you as a checklist. So you either accept it all or you're not a Christian. That's been a really devastating thing as well for the faith, because people aren't hearing the gospel and wrestling with Jesus. They're saying, do I want to accept this total package in my life? And it's like, no, I don't. But even so, this is exile and return. That might be a good way, Carol, to connect us more to these exiles and returns, because the church has been through hard times, and we still have ministry to do.
Well, I don't see a whole lot of younger people coming to church these days.
No.
It seems, in the last 5 years, the number of young people coming to church,
yep.
I think the number is dropping.
Yep. Yeah, it got more infrequent, but still connected, like at youth ministry things or occasional with families. And then it became sort of, the pandemic really just kind of was like, well, now we can just sort of make an exit. Maybe there'll still be some people coming back. But yeah, it's a challenge all over. It's not a Lutheran thing. It's a big challenge pretty much everywhere. Yeah, unless you're having babies like Mormons, you're not really a growing church. And a lot of the churches that are growing are consolidating Christians from other churches. They just have become the sort of most attractive church in the area. But it's not. The growth is a little bit of an illusion. It's more of a conglomeration. But again, the church is Jesus Christ, so he's still alive. So we don't have to worry about the future of the church because it's him. And it doesn't change our witness. We just, we carry forward.
Well, I hope these younger people come back someday.
Yeah, and there's still, a lot of it is just there's a changed relationship to the church, but there's still a contact when there's, look at like Cecil Damon has his special Sunday, and there's 30 people from his family in church, and every single one of them could make their church home here, or anywhere else. And maybe some do, and I just don't know. But they have a relationship with God. Most of them, I think, have a faith. Most of them, I think, have an affection for Bethesda and at least its heritage in their family. So it's really hard to just look at declining churches and say, well, there's nothing outside of us. There's a lot out there. God is active, but yeah, but it's a challenge. Woo. Now we're pumped up for Isaiah 51, right? Well, I'll start from the beginning of the chapter here. Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father and to Sarah who bore you. For he was but one when I called him, but I blessed him and made him many. For the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. Listen to me, my people, and give heed to me, my nation, for a teaching will go out from me, and my justice for a light to the peoples. I will bring near my deliverance swiftly. My salvation has gone out, and my arms will rule the peoples. The coastlands wait for me, and for my arm they hope. Then he gets a little more kind of cosmic in his attention. So now it's lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth. The heavens will vanish like smoke, the earth wear out like a garment. Those who live on it will die like gnats, but my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. An encouragement not to fear. And then down in kind of midway through verse 9, talks about the arm of the Lord, which is a common phrase not only for this, well, it was a common phrase about the Exodus. Awake as in the days of old, the generations of long ago, was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to cross over? So shall the ransom of the Lord, so the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. That Rahab thing, it's like, what is that? That's not the prostitute Rahab from Jericho. Her name is Rahab, and this is Rahab. Rahab, we'll get to her. We actually have something to learn from her today, but Rahab here, this is basically a cosmic dragon. This is sort of a mythological figure. Rahab comes up actually a couple places as a code name for Egypt. So when the prophet here is bringing up Rahab, it's another nod to Egypt. But again, not what he's looking at is, when we look at political realities, exile and return from Egypt, or when we look at our own political realities, the prophet would have us also look up to the heavens and realize, Rahab the dragon, so to speak, that God is defeating powers unseen, that there are other things going on behind the spiritual veil, that this isn't just what people are doing to each other, or what nations are doing to nations, but there is more behind the scene. And so this is a reminder the prophet gives us that when God brought his people out of Egypt, he also cut Rahab in pieces and pierced the dragon. We studied Exodus at Daytimers a few years ago now and talked about how the plagues were like direct attacks on certain gods of Egypt, the god of the Nile and the god of livestock, and etc. This was a pretty common way. Not only Rahab here, but other places talk about Leviathan or Behemoth. It's kind of like when we talk about, like, we might compare the devil to Sauron from the Lord of the Rings, or we might say Jesus is like Aslan, or we might say Samson is like Hercules. So it's sort of, the prophet is taking the poetry and the mythological kind of work of his neighbors, the Babylonians, and saying God is not just rescuing his people, but he's actually defeating the gods and the idols of these other powers.
Pastor Tom?
Yeah.
Got a question. Rahab the prostitute, was she a prostitute or a single woman? Because the men call single women prostitutes.
I don't think that she was just a single woman. I think she was a prostitute. Okay. But have you come across a study that suggested there was more to that?
I have this concept that means much of the Bible was written by men. It might have a male-dominated focus.
Well, I mean, we.
And it does.
Yeah. Well, we'll see in a little bit that Rahab's going to come up, because there's kind of a nice play on words, because Rahab is a Exodus figure too, since she really helped Joshua lead the people into the promised land, and specifically to lead them to Jericho, to success in Jericho. Let's see here. Yeah, it's the word. She's called a prostitute, and it's not just, that's the noun, but the verbal form of it means like to commit fornication or to be unfaithful. So that's how she's introduced in the text.
Sure.
But yeah, you wouldn't put it past men to give somebody a nickname. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right, so whether it's Rahab, like we just read, the dragon, or whether it's Leviathan or some of these other creatures, what we're also getting a hint at is that the Exodus, again, is not just a political thing, but it's also cosmic, spiritual, something more, which also means that God isn't just redeeming a people, but God is bringing about new creation. That those, all those Canaanite or Babylonian gods, like a Rahab, they're not just gods who sort of showed up. They're gods who show up in all their own creation myths. There are gods that are fighting and contending and enslaving people and all this stuff. And so for God to defeat them and to quiet the sea of chaos and all these kinds of ways that the prophets talk, it's to say God is not just, again, saving a people or moving them from refugees and exiles to home, but God is actually recreating or healing, renewing his creation, dealing with that cosmic chaos. Just a little further in Isaiah 52, Isaiah 52, 9 through 12. Break forth into singing, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Depart, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of it. Purify yourselves, you who carry the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go in flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. This is great. The ends of the earth, we already noted that the book of Acts is based on Jesus saying, you'll be my witnesses in Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So we already see this happening. But when the people are told to depart, to go out from there, touch no unclean thing, this can go all the way forward to the book of Revelation, when Babylon, the harlot, is sort of the code name for Rome, or for any sort of power, national power that's antichrist. And the people in Revelation are told to come out from Babylon, or to come out from her. Paul actually quotes this section in Isaiah 52 when he talks to the Corinthians. He talks to the Corinthians about separating oneself from communion with idols. And he actually gives us then that little clue of what does it mean for us as 21st century Americans to not be in exile, other than being told to stay home occasionally. Well, here's one example. Paul quotes these sections of Isaiah to tell all of us to have no communion with idolatry. So that if you have an idol, you are enslaved and need exodus. And talk about the things that the idols we have available at our fingertips these days. the idols have always been available, but have taken on quite addictive forms. Idolatry. I heard a guy on a podcast this week. He just came up with a really catchy way to think about the pressures we're facing this couple of years. He says, if you feel like you can't breathe, it's because you're in a CPR situation. And the CPR is COVID is the C, political idolatry is the P, and racial hostility is the R. And he says, no wonder you can't breathe, because you're in the moment of CPR. And, gosh, you think about those things. So no, we're not enslaved in Egypt. And no, none of us in this room are homeless. But we do have a shelf of idols in our hearts. We do have things that we fear, love, and trust instead of the one true God, or in competition with the one true God. I know I do. And Luther said there are no atheists. He says, because everybody has a God. Everybody has somewhere they turn to look for all good and to run to for refuge in trouble. And we all have those things. To come away from idolatry is to come and be exodused by Jesus.
So, question I have about idols is, and I've had it off and on for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Could our children be our idols? Are our children our idols?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Are you confessing, or are you just wondering? Yeah.
I don't like that answer, but anyway, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that.
Yeah.
So what does God think about that, you think?
Well, if you try to turn your children or your spouse into an idol, you'll crush them or be crushed by them. And Lord knows we do it. What we have to keep in mind is, it's not that we're supposed to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength and have nothing left for our neighbors as ourselves. We're also to love our neighbors as ourselves. And God has called some of us to be parents. So, it's how do I worship the Creator in serving this created good called a child, versus how do I worship the creation, giving no thanks to the Creator. Really tempting. And really, since in early 1970s, a psychologist published a book called The Denial of Death, and he talked about how as the culture becomes increasingly secular, something has to take the place of God in the heart. And his prediction was we would end up with what he called, and this was a Jewish atheist writing this book. So he's not condemning everyone else who's not a believer like him. He says, his prediction was you'll see the rise of apocalyptic romance, in which falling in love or being in love is the greatest good. That being single is the worst. Being married means you'll have a soulmate, not a spouse, you'll have a soulmate. Perfectly compatible. And, and this guy in 1970 didn't even know that, Google can give you the algorithm to show you exactly who you're compatible with. But that marriage or a romance, even if it's not marriage, but romance would take the place of God in our great hopes. I think if he was around today, he might say that children have taken the place of romance, that there's a lot more skepticism about marriage, or even about romance, as even that it's sort of silly to think that you'll have one partner for life, or would even want that. But children then become like your most permanent relationship. You'll never not have your child, God willing, right? You'll never not have this relationship with your child. But romance might come and go. So I kind of suspect children have become one of the new idols.
That's a challenge.
Yeah.
Well, don't you just think society. I mean, when I grew up, my grandmother lived with us, and you really were taught to respect your elders, and seniors were, respected. And now I feel like, now that I am one, that it's more the children that are, and I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just saying that I think the focus of just society in general has changed.
We cater to the children's needs instead of children having to cater to the needs of adults who are trying to have a conversation in the kitchen, and the kids just can't shut up. Sorry, now I'm confessing. Yeah.
Don't believe you're the only one.
No, I don't. No, I don't. But it's, yeah. Yeah. Well, and actually, the flip side of the idolatry of children is I've seen more young couples deciding never to have kids, because what kind of a world are they bringing them into? I mean, there's not going to be a livable, hospitable planet for the kid to grow up in anyway. I mean, these are things I actually hear from people. It's not just like fear mongering, that it's not the time to continue to overpopulate the planet or something, right? That's a way to idolize children, by not having them. Others make decisions during pregnancy because better for a child to have its life ceased in the womb than to have a child grow up poor or with parents unable to take care of them, or to be adopted and raised by other people who aren't your parents. So there's a lot of other kinds of ways that we idolize children, or at least, say that we, with the thing about idols is you never call them idols. you love them and you value them. And so it's not like we try to harm them or be harmed by them. Yeah, idolatry is a hard one. And it's, like I said, it's happening. It's happening in a lot of ways, not just among our kids or our spouses, but it's happening politically too. In fact, if you're in my book club, we read that Seculosity book a couple of year or two ago, where David Zoll basically suggests several different ways that people are trying to have a religious relationship to something that's not God. And parenting was one of them, and politics was another of them. But I think this really is the connecting point for us today, is when we see how the Old Testament carries the Exodus motif forward, and how then Jesus carries this forward. I mean, what time of year did Jesus decide to go to Jerusalem and sort of unleash the events of his crucifixion? What time of the year was that? Passover. Interesting, and I've said it before here, but he could have chosen the Day of Atonement. He could have timed it with Yom Kippur. I mean, he certainly was the atoning sacrifice for sin. That would have been perfect timing. But he was putting his story right in the middle of that great Exodus story, even taking the great Passover meal and now making it his own body and blood that preserves us. I like too, we read it, but I didn't want to pass this part over too. It's just that hope from Isaiah 52, that 52:12, for you shall not go out in haste and you shall not go in flight, for the Lord will go before you and be your rear guard. That's better than Exodus. Exodus, you leave in haste. You have flat bread. There's no time to bake bread, right? But here in this new Exodus, this cosmic Exodus, this worldwide Exodus, you don't have to hurry. Jesus has got you. And you don't have to worry that some Pharaoh is going to be resurrected behind you and come after you. And so then you got to get past the river or something. Jesus leads us out in peace. We're not in haste. And he's before us. It's like that breastplate of St. Patrick: Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ to shield me, Christ above me, Christ on my left and my right. I don't want to go any further in the scriptures. I'll say, if you want to do your own study, I would point you to Jeremiah 16, from verse 14 and on, Jeremiah 16:14, you'll get another example of the Exodus and Egypt being sort of being used again. One interesting thing about that one in Jeremiah 16 is that when God brings people back to their homeland, he does it by sending fishermen. Who else sent fishermen? Jesus. Follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Jesus is quoting Jeremiah 16, who's drawing on the Exodus to say, God's not just going to say, come home, come home. He's going to actually go catch us. He's going to send people, fishers of people, to go and bring us home because we don't want to be caught. We want to keep swimming in our own stream. So I think that's a neat one. Another one is Jeremiah 23. You can also find that, Jeremiah 23:5, more about David the branch. And then the last prophet that Chad Bird gives us is Hosea 2. The first part of Hosea chapter 2 is just a really, really unsettling, violent portrait of Israel as God's unfaithful wife. It's very hard to read. But by verse 14, Hosea 2:14, from that forward, you get God alluring her and speaking tenderly to her in the wilderness and saying, now you'll call me my husband because I'll remove the names of the Baals from your mouth. And there's a play on words in that, which we don't have time to look at, but there's a play on words in that, which connects us to Rahab, the prostitute's story in Jericho. So, Israel, who's played the role of a harlot, unfaithful to God, now becomes spoken to tenderly, and you're reminded of Rahab, the prostitute, as you now see God taking us back as his beloved wife. And this becomes a major source for Paul and for the book of Revelation to say the church is the bride of Christ, and Christ is the bridegroom who redeems us. So that's another one you can take time with, Hosea 2:14 and forward. So yeah, I think that's good. There's a couple other little things, but I don't want to belabor that. But Exodus, this is the big story of the scripture. There's probably the most famous Lutheran theologian of the last century, American theologian. His name was Robert Jensen. He just died just before the pandemic. And, like a lot of theologians, people had to ask him, how would you say that briefly? So they said, who is God? And Jensen said, God is whoever raised Jesus Christ from the dead after having raised Israel from Egypt. God is whoever, that force, that person, that power. God is whoever raised that guy, having previously raised those people. So for him, the death and resurrection of Israel out of Egypt, and death and resurrection of Jesus, that God is whoever did that, right? That's who God is. He raised Jesus, and he had raised Israel previously. That's who God is. And that's enough for us, right? So, okay. Thanks for your study. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for helping us to connect it to life in our world today. And God bless you and keep you until I see you again.